Hey there, welcome to Lennox's history class, and today we're going to take on something that often seems monumental for U.S. history students. We are going to learn how to source documents. And how are we going to do that? We're going to do that by bringing the HIPP to APUSH. So let's get started. Document analysis is key to understanding U.S. history because U.S. history is built on documents, whether they be primary or secondary sources. And one thing students often have trouble doing is sourcing those documents, using those documents to prove a thesis or an idea. So when you approach these documents, you have to approach them with the idea of how is this document relevant or important to the question that I'm trying to answer. And when you take that document, you use that for clues. And there's clues throughout the documents. There's a lot of clues in the source. There's clues in the actual writings or drawings that you're going to be looking at. And your job as a history detective is to solve the puzzle and use that document to prove a point, to prove your thesis in this case. There's 4 ways that you can accomplish this. And we call that hipping the document. The first one is historical context, the H in the HIPP. And what you have to ask yourself when you're looking at historical context is what led to the creation of this document? Why was it created? And what does it lead to? Are there laws, policies, people that the document was inspired by? Be careful, because historical context is not contextualization. Contextualization is about the time period you're talking about. Context is the reason why the document was created. For example, the Declaration of Independence. The context is that the colonies were declaring their independence. That's why they wrote that document. And so that's how you have to look at each document that you're going to source. Why was it created? What led to that document actually coming into existence? So I don't like to call it historical context. I actually like to call it historical situation because I think that captures more of what you're trying to do. So from now on, we're going to refer to this as historical situation. So, historical situation. What are we going to look for when we look at a document? For instance, what's the date? What's going on at the time that that document has been created? And are there any events that maybe influenced the writer or the creator of that document at the time? The example I'm going to use throughout this presentation is Paul Revere's engraving of the Boston Massacre. If you look at the source down at the bottom, it says that this was the bloody massacre perpetrated on March 5th, 1770. So you have the date, you have the setting. And so what is going to lead Paul Revere to create this engraving? And I have an example right there for you. It says this propaganda engraving, and it was propaganda, and hopefully you understand what that is, but this propaganda engraving was created shortly after the Boston Massacre as England was increasing its control in the colonies, illustrating Revere's attempt to unify the colonies against English rule. If you look in that statement, the bolded part is the situation. This was created right after the Boston Massacre as England was increasing its control in the colonies. So it gives you an idea of what's going on with regards to this particular document. So that's historical situation. Now let's get the I in HIPP, and that's the intended audience. Who was this created for, and who are they speaking to, and why? Okay, here's the big thing. It's very tempting when you look at something like this to say, oh, it was created for the people. It's never created for the people. You have to be more specific. What people and why? So in this example, this engraving was created and distributed to the English colonies outside of Boston to gain support against British rule. So who is it written for? It's written for the English colonies. Probably what would have been better if I would have said the English colonists, because that's even more specific. But you can see that it's not just people, it's people in the English colonies outside of Boston. So that's intended audience. So let's talk about the first P in HIPP, purpose. Now, purpose is basically telling why the document was created. It's the why behind everything. If it's a speech, the why is it wants to influence an audience. If it's a letter, it probably wants to influence an individual. And if it's a diary or journal entry, we don't typically think of that trying to sway anybody's beliefs, but what it does create is a historical record of something that happened. That's what we're talking about in purpose. Now, purpose is completely different than what the document says. For example, the Declaration of Independence. That was written to the English colonists. And the purpose was to explain why the Second Continental Congress was breaking away or decided to break away from England. I haven't said anything about what's in the actual document. I'm just telling you about why it was written. Okay? Example here is the Paul Revere engraving. Once again, the propaganda engraving is designed to create unity among the colonists against the growing English control in North America. So why did Paul Revere create this engraving and send it out? To encourage unification of all the colonists outside of Boston to come together against British rule. Doesn't even talk anything about what's in the drawing there at all. Second P, point of view, or sometimes you refer to it as the author's perspective. What are you going to look for here? What is the position of the author or creator of this document, and how does it impact what they're saying? You want to say that their point of view is a patriot living in Boston, or a woman living under whatever. That everyone has a point of view. So what you're trying to do is provide what position or what belief maybe that the author is coming from. In this case, again, the engraving was created by Paul Revere, a patriot living in Boston seeking public support to mobilize against British rule in the colonies. You understand when you look at this engraving that Paul Revere was a patriot who was trying to, get people behind his idea of independence. And that's important when you look at historical documents to understand the point of view. Because if you don't understand that, you can go off on some rabbit trail or completely misinterpret what the document's trying to say. So how do you include all this in an essay? And yeah, all this leads to writing an essay. It's the famous DBQ, the document-based question. You're going to be writing DBQs this year where you're going to have to analyze documents. And so how do you use all of this information I just gave you in your actual essay? The easiest, best way to do it is in a standalone sentence. After you've written the sentence that explains why this document proves your thesis, now you go into sourcing. And I would just start it this way. The historical context is. The purpose of the document is. That's I think the easiest way or best way to do it. That way you don't forget it. You can also write what's called an appositive statement. And that's the statement that includes your sourcing within a sentence that you wrote to prove your thesis or topic. I kind of do that with what I did here. This is a positive statement because I have the sourcing within the sentence that I'm using to show how the document supports a thesis. So the engraving was created by Paul Revere, a patriot living in Boston seeking public support to mobilize against the British rule. So I'm saying that this document supports my thesis in that it shows there was a movement to unify the colonists against Great Britain, but it has the point of view of Paul Revere within that statement. But either way you do it, you need to include sourcing when you're writing a document-based question, when you're writing a DBQ. It's very important to the overall score that you will get on that essay. So I did a picture because pictures are easy, but what about documents? What about things like this right here, the Declaration of Independence? I have the opening paragraph to the Declaration of Independence. And a lot of times people have a hard time reading historical documents because sometimes they are hard to read. Documents written in the 1700s, the language is more formal and it's a little bit more difficult. Here's my advice. First of all, read the document. I know, makes sense, right? Because then if you can summarize it and you understand basically what it's saying, then you can go back and HIPP it. Okay? So that's it. That's just a quick overview on sourcing documents specifically for APUSH. Hopefully this helped. If not, just rewind and find the parts that you need. Now, when you write your essays, when you write these DBQs, you don't have to do all 4 strategies. You only have to do 1. So you can do historical context or intended audience or purpose or point of view. Find one that works for you and just become an expert at it. So that's my advice today. Hopefully you're having fun. We'll see you next time. Bye-bye.